Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of our three-part series where we talk about the big three of Jewish writings, if you like, which are the Torah, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. And we walked through this forest of information by our very amenable and friendly rabbi in Florida, Rabbi Joshua Neely, who gives his time so willingly. I'm very grateful for. This week we are looking at Mishnah. As the further we go away from the Torah, the more uncomfortable and unfamiliar I am with my surroundings. So the questions this week might be particularly naive because of my inexperience with the subject matter. But we're just going to jump straight in. So last week we talked about Torah.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
Let me throw a little something in there
Okay.
before we jump too much straight in. So first of all, one, if you have a question, I'm sure lots of other people do as well. But even more to the point, if you have a question, chances are it's a question that I have had at some point as well. It's important for the people who are listening to know that I was not raised with a traditional knowledge of these texts either. I was raised in a Reform background, very active, very committed to Judaism, very good education, but it was a very good Reform education, which I knew about the Mishnah, I knew about the Gemara, but I wasn't actually immersed in them. That was an adult decision that I made. And it was a decision I made after asking many, many questions about these texts and how they fit together and how they worked with the Judaism that I had been raised with when I made the transition to a conservative Judaism lifestyle. So it's important for people listening to know that you don't have to be born with this, you don't have to be raised with this, and there are good answers to the questions of how does this all fit together that can be compelling to people even who are outside the system initially.
All right, that gives us all hope. Thank you very much. So last week we talked about the Torah, which is something that most people, at least as 5 books, they can go to their shelf and have a look at. The Mishnah is slightly different. Most people, I think, especially if they could have a very religious lifestyle, but perhaps wouldn't dip into the Mishnah too much. Would that be right?
Correct. Most people wouldn't have a copy of the Mishnah. A lot of people tend to think the Mishnah is this huge additional set of volumes, and it is usually printed that way because it's printed with additional commentary on the Mishnah. But the Mishnah itself, its own text, is not that huge of a text. It was meant to be learned and memorized, and so making it too long would be problematic. So yeah, the Mishnah is not a huge book, but you're not going to find it on every bookshelf.
Is it a good place to start with why we have it before we figure out why we have it? So, I mean,
Oh,
what happened that the Mishnah became a physical thing rather than a collection of tradition and ideas and law?
well, actually, let's start with why people don't have it on their bookshelf, and then we'll rewind to why it exists at all.
Sure.
So the reason why people don't have it on their bookshelf is that for most people in the average day-to-day life, they don't need to consult it. They don't need to look something up in it. The Mishnah is the laying down of the base understanding of how to do Judaism, but the practical application, what we call halacha lema'aseh, the actual halacha, the actual Jewish law that as it gets implemented, is based upon the practice as it has continued to develop and progress by precedent and additional rulings over the last 2,000 years. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't jibe with the Mishnah, but it does mean that most people are raised doing things based upon what they see around them, based upon what they learn in their religious school studies, in their classrooms, by when they ask their rabbi. So there's it's sort of a foundational text, but it isn't a text that people use day to day to figure out their answers from. But it is at the root, which to come back to your other question of, well, so where does the Mishnah come from and why is it a thing? We're sort of working our way back through the timeline. The Mishnah, as I think we mentioned in the preface, is often called the Oral Torah. And it was called the Oral Torah because it is the oral set of instructions of how to decipher, how to decode, how to extrapolate the practical implications of the Torah into a regular life. And that is something that I want to just take a couple minutes to make sure that everybody's on the same page with, if you pardon the pun about being on the same page with the oral Torah. There's a feeling I get sometimes from people that the word interpretation or the word exposition is tainted. It's somehow a very subjective idea, and therefore you have your interpretation, I have my interpretation, and everybody's interpretation is fine. And don't tell me an interpretation is authoritative, because it's just an interpretation. It's just an interpretation. That's really a very flawed way of looking at things. First of all, there are some interpretations that are categorically wrong. That is to say, there are interpretations of the Torah and interpretations of the Bible as a whole that do not find any validation within the text themselves. Yes, the words they begin with are there, but where they are run with is entirely up to the person with the interpretation, and they do not match or mesh or in any way synchronize with either the context that it's taken from or any other context within the Bible. They only match what the intention is of the interpreter. When we talk about Jewish interpretation, there are built-in safeguards that prevent that from happening. First of all, it is public, and second of all, it is raucous. That is to say, there is review, peer review, as they would say in scientific journals, meaning that the information of the interpretation is put out. It is always collected and collated and correlated to other aspects within the Tanakh and within rabbinic literature and within the Torah, of course. And then it is reviewed over and over again to make sure that it works. And that's going to be even more important when we get to the Gemara discussion. So when we talk about the Mishnah being the interpretation of the Torah, of being the set of instructions that go along with the Torah to make sure that you can unpack it and use it, it is a privileged set of interpretations. It is not just an interpretation. All right, how'd that go? Make sense?
I think I get what you're saying. I know we've used the analogy of a piece of IKEA furniture before.
Right.
I guess you could look at the Torah as the written instruction on the left, stages 1 through 13, and maybe the 32 illustrations of how you interpret those 13 as the Mishnah. Everyone's going to put a slightly different speed or ferocity at putting the screw into that hole and using the screwdriver, but they're going to be using the same screwdriver in the same hole. Would that be fair? The result is the same, the workings are the same, but there might be some fluidity in getting to the bigger picture of how the result and the workings came about.
Correct, and to push the analogy even further, because I think that's a very good way of putting it. There is so much that we take for granted, having lived at the current tail end of all of this discussion. Hopefully, another 1,000 years will be called the middle. That we're not even aware of. You take the IKEA set of instructions. The idea of what is that picture of a screwdriver. What do you do with that? How do you use it? The idea that you will go clockwise rather than counterclockwise when you are screwing something in is something that is learned orally. It's something that may not even be on the page anywhere. And the idea that, well, at least as I was raised, that if you really want something to stick together that you're putting together, you need to use glue. And that's not on the page, but it is known by anyone who has ever done any woodworking that a couple bits of metal bolts are not going to really hold bits of wood together as well as they would if you had glue. So the Mishnah is that glue, is that clockwise turn. It's that extra bit of information that is implied as necessary by the written instruction, but is passed orally because it is the most efficient means of transmitting it. So go ahead.
One of the when I was wondering how we're going to give a picture of the oral Torah, the concept of an oral Torah, and the need for an oral Torah, I looked around the apartment I'm in, and I thought if I picked someone from the rainforest and I dropped them in this apartment and left them on their own for a week, they would scold themselves on the kettle, they'd burn themselves on the oven, they wouldn't understand how the plumbing works in the bathroom. Because I've grown up in a house like this, I understand that the kettle gets hot and that the oven is hot and that the fridge is cold, and that's for food. And it's
Right.
not where food magically appears, so you have to put it in. But if you take someone outside of that history and then place them within that and different society, they need instruction on all of these things. And I think that when the we're going to get there, but when the need for the oral Torah to be recorded
Mm.
started to occur, I think that was what was happening. There wasn't perhaps the passing on of really like common knowledge, and so that's perhaps why we started looking at the Mishnah as an idea as a physical form. But I just thought
And,
I'd throw that in.
and the rainforest is a good analogy, but I'd like to correct it in one way because it sets up an analogy that there's somebody who is totally unfamiliar with our way of life. But even people who are familiar with our way of life still need oral instructions constantly. The most common example, of course, are children. You don't sit a child down with a giant book that says modern life and say, I'll be back in 18 years and you'll be an adult. You give them books about history and mathematics and all sorts of other secular academic subjects. But when it comes time to making dinner, you don't hand them a book about dinner. Yeah, you get them to learn about nutrition, you get them to learn about basic chemistry and all of that. But when you're standing at the stove, you are explaining to them exactly how to do things. When you are washing up the dishes, you are explaining how this works and the drying here and the one tub here and one tub there and use this soap here and no, you don't do that together. That's all orally explained because it simply is necessary to transmit it that way. And to come back to why oral, we mentioned this before, but it bears repeating because it's a real point of confusion for many people. The oralness of the Mishnah continues right up to today. The Mishnah is still taught orally in the sense that no one would expect anyone to pick up a written Mishnah and just understand it all by themselves. They still need a teacher and discussion, precisely because it is a teacher who can look you in the eye, see if you understand, answer the question that you've just had, find another way to reframe the explanation in order to actually reach the student. And that is the great goal of the Mishnah, is to take that understanding and reach it to every single individual student as best as it can. And for a few hundred years, about 1,000 years after the Torah was given, that was the main vehicle of the Mishnah, was taking that and transmitting it over and over again orally and adapting the explanation, not the content, but the explanation, teacher to student as was needed in every single situation.
It's worth mentioning as well, and there are going to be some people listening to this who don't buy into the concept of an oral Torah. Their opinion is fine. It's worth mentioning that the actual Torah was an oral Torah for a really long time, and it was just read once every 7 years to the whole of Israel, who then were expected to pass that on to their kids and pass it on to their kids. And it wasn't really till the end of Moses' lifetime that he was compelled or asked to write down everything I have told you. So it's not the actual Torah bears witness to the fact that this kind of information can be kept in the community orally through generation to generation to generation. I thought it's worth mentioning. Okay.
Correct. And to not to belabor the point, but the Torah itself begs for further explanation time and time again. It gives statements that if you were to take as a commandment, which obviously we do, you would say, okay, so how do I do that? What counts as removing the blood from meat? Right? Because do I need to get a little syringe and suck every blood thing out? How do I do that? Okay, I don't eat the blood, but I know that if I'm eating meat, when I first cut it off the animal, there's blood still embedded in that meat. How do I get it out? the Torah doesn't tell me explicitly in its own surface level of reading. The Torah tells me that I should recite these words in the morning and the evening. What counts as morning? Well, what counts as evening? Which exact words is it referring to? How am I supposed to do this? So the Torah begs for elucidation. And much of that elucidation is embedded within the text of the Torah itself if you read it carefully, if you read each word as helping to explain every other word. But that is a process that is extremely difficult to do as an individual and prone to error, which is why the oral Torah helps walk you through the process to make sure you come to the right answer, to make sure that you're actually doing Torah properly.
So is the Mishnah the oral Torah?
Yes, is the short answer. So Mishnah is an oral Torah. So the issue becomes then, what do we have now in our hands when I hold up a book that says Mishnah on it? What do I have in my hands? Do I have the one and the only oral Torah? And the answer is yes, but I also have an oral Torah. I have an example of the one and only oral Torah. So when you read the traditional literature about the Mishnah itself, and this is, again, as I usually try to do, modern academics are wonderful, but I like to read the tradition from the tradition's perspective. And when you read the tradition's own reflections on what this is and how it came to be and why, it's quite clear that every teacher and every school of thought within Judaism had its way of teaching things, even though they all agreed on what needed to be taught. So they all agreed on what time you should actually say the Shema in the evening. Nobody was really arguing about that. But how do you convey that information to the student? Do you give them the ideal first, and then do you give them the final time? Do you give them the final time first, and then talk about the ideal? Do you explain in general that we have ideals, and then talk about the final time, and then talk about the specific ideal? There's different ways to teach, and every teacher knows that depending upon your student, you'll start in slightly different ways, you'll use different metaphors, you'll explain it differently, but at the end of the day, 2 plus 2 is still going to equal 4. Right? Some teachers will do it with beans, some teachers will do it with chips, some teachers will do it with food, whatever works to get the student going. The Mishnah that we have is the compilation by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in around the year 250 CE, Rabbi Judah the Prince, for those looking in English, where he took what he felt were the most condensed and precise, not precise meaning accurate, but precise meaning not a single word extra than was absolutely necessary version of explaining the oral Torah that would be best able to be memorized and to be transmitted without fear of leaving something out in an explanation. So it would be 100% inclusive and conclusive for the community. And that way everybody would start with a reliable set of explanations that even if they didn't understand them all, because after all it hadn't been explained and unpacked for them, they would at least have all the components that would be right. To go back to our IKEA metaphor, they would have a complete kit and they would have the right instruction pack. So even if they weren't 100% sure how to put it all together yet, we'll talk about that more when we get to the Gemara, they at least would have 100% of the pieces in that pack, and they'd have a good example of the instructions. And for most people, that would get you most of the way.
Now, is it fair? I know that so the way it was recorded was nearly in text speak, right? So there was he used as few words as possible, and almost acronymed them. It's like the every good boy deserves food thing that you use to remember the scales.
Right, a mnemonic, yes.
Right, and it was very tight. Now, for me, for one person to correlate all that information in such a smart and concise way, almost like a secretary doing shorthand, seems a little. I mean, it's a big task. is it genuinely all his work, or were there other people who were doing smaller pieces, and he kind of amalgamated it all together into one writing? Was it actually all of
More the latter.
his? Sorry.
And the tradition itself says it's more the latter. It wasn't that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi sat down and said, how can I explain what time to say the Shema? He would, look, Rabbi Meir over here has a really good mnemonic that he uses for explaining this. So I'm going to take his, and I'm going to use it. And there's a couple other points that a few other rabbis make that are important, so I'll add in a sentence or two from them. And that becomes that discussion. And he went to Rabbi Meir an awful lot. Rabbi Meir was considered the best and brightest of his generation. And he said, okay, he also explains this really well. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to use that. So he himself, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, rarely added any of his own material. That is to say, his own method of explaining. He was primarily relying on the words of the other sages, those that either were in his generation or immediately before him, or those that were being quoted by other rabbis from further back in antiquity.
So what compelled him to start this in the first place?
So this is a matter of debate and discussion. So there are two competing theories. There is the traditional theory, which is often taken in one way, but might mean something different. So let me walk through that. So the traditional theory, as it is often taught, is times were getting bad. The Jewish community was in midst of rack and ruin, and therefore they were worried about learning being lost. Because if you don't have a vibrant, strong community, you can't set up good lines of communication and education to make sure that everything is transmitted accurately. So he said, all right, so we've got this trouble here going on. Let's put together a survival kit. Let's put together a single text that people can carry in their brain. Again, it was meant to be memorized more than written. And they will be able to go anywhere and have that in their kit. And they can then unpack it when they arrive and be able to live a good Jewish life according to Jewish law. So that's sort of the traditional model. The problem with that model historically is that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi actually lived at a period with relatively good social settings. He himself was very wealthy. He wasn't called the prince by accident, although Hanassi was more of a community title than royalty. But he lived very well. His community was quite economically stable at the time. There have been ups and downs in Jewish life prior and after that, but he was on sort of an upswing during his generation. But there was a lot of diverging opinions. There were many different versions of the teachings from subsects and different groups. And so what the traditional story might have actually been talking about wasn't that economically we were in rack and ruin, but that we were becoming more chaotic in our teachings and our understanding. And so what he wanted to do was clear away all of the chaff, all of the teachings that may have worked for somebody at one point, but were not clear when they were disconnected from the original teacher. It'd be like going through 50 years of old lesson plans at a public school. And sure, some of the stuff that they used to teach back in the 1950s, yeah, that was algebra. But the way they taught it, man, if you put that in front of a kid now, they're not going to understand a single word you're saying. So we're just going to have to take some of those old lesson plans and throw them out, because if you leave them in the file cabinet, some new teacher's going to pick one of those old lesson plans, and they're going to try and explain algebra, and we're going to lose a whole generation of math students. So instead, we'll make sure that only the foolproof, absolutely fail-safe, good lesson plans are going to be the ones that are left, so that everyone starts with that good version.
Now, I know that the Talmud as a whole, the final, if you like, the final iteration of these books, is divided into sections. Is the Mishna the same? Is it categorized?
Yes, and that was one of the great inventions of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, was that he systematized the learning thematically, categorically. Now, it's not thematically and categorically in a modern sense. It's not an encyclopedia. It's not a dictionary where everything is in perfect order, but it is thematically grouped, and so you'll find the laws of blessings all within the same section, what's called a Masechet. And that's really, really handy, because anybody who's ever tried to find a mitzvah directly in the Torah will know the Torah, for all of its beauties, is not really a systematic document that is very easy to look up like an appendix to find information like that. And you will have different topics from different areas of life scattered all within the same chapter sometimes. And then topics that are about the same thing scattered across multiple chapters, sometimes multiple books. And so you have to look in 4 different places to get all the information you need. So what he did was to pull all that together so that it would be a lot easier to remember and a lot easier to teach.
So we've got this one guy pulling in the finest work from the biggest and brightest in the community to not condense, but to record the unfolding and unraveling of the Torah. Now, for one guy, as I said, that's a big job. Did he miss anything out? Were there iterations after that needed to be done to include things which weren't included then?
No, and depends what you mean. So first of all, he's not the only person to have done something like this in Jewish history. He's sort of the first. But when you get to someone like Rambam, Maimonides, who we talked about before, his ability to systematize even more material, because he lived later, into the Mishnah Torah, which is even more cohesive and even more systemic in the sense of exactly, paragraph by paragraph, precisely in a certain order, it is also incredibly impressive. So, and of course, modern researchers and scientists and organizers of any type do the same work all the time. Categorization and pulling together material into a cohesive whole is a skill, but it's not a unique skill only to him. So he was impressive, but he wasn't unique in his ability to do this. So we don't need to make him into a miracle worker. And that also make sure that what he did, we understand, is definitely within the realm of human possibility. Did he leave anything out? Right, so this is where we're going to get to when we start talking about the Gemara. Right, so did he leave anything out? The answer is no, he didn't leave anything out. However, it would have helped if we'd had a little bit more in some places. So there's a difference between leaving something out in the sense that it was incomplete, but as this was the hyper-condensed version, there were other versions that taught the same material that had more words, that were longer, or that were parallel and contained some information that wasn't immediately obvious within the Mishnah itself. It is implied once you know you're looking for it, but it might have helped if you were writing a standalone text to have had more words rather than fewer. But that comes back to the problem, is he wasn't trying to write a standalone text. He was trying to write a giant memory aid that was the perfect condensed version, that if you remembered it and you had studied it with a real-life human teacher, when you remembered it, you would also remember the unfolding of its explanations. And that then becomes the problem that the Gemara has to handle with.
So I'm a teenager, I've just got the keys to my first second-hand car, it's a Mini Cooper, it's outside, I start the engine, it's not working, and I open up the bonnet, and I run inside to YouTube, and I'm like, oh wow, I've just found a video in which the guy who designed this engine is going to give me a 5-minute tutorial. And I think that's what it is. For the guy listening, he has no clue about how a car works. And he's going for information from this guy who knows everything about the car, and he assumes that you know everything about that car as well. Would that be a fair comparison?
Yes, in fact, it's I haven't used that metaphor, and I may steal it. But whenever I teach Mishnah, one of the things I always tell people before we start, and repeat it over and over again, is the Mishnah is one of the most empowering documents you can ever read, because the Mishnah assumes that apart from the page you're currently reading, you know everything else. So it'll make a reference to something from another part of the Mishnah that you haven't read yet, but it assumes you've already learned that. It assumes you already are living that. And so it's not going to explain it in this page because it thinks you already know it from another page. And vice versa, when you reach the other page, it assumes you know the page that you were studying when you were confused about what the other page said. So it is not a very good self-explaining document. It is a very good self-cohesive document. And like you said, it's like being taught by someone who assumes that you already know what they're teaching you. They're just teaching you best how to remember it. And that makes it really hard if you use it as a standalone document, which is why, to go back to our first discussion, even though I can hold up a one-volume version of the Mishnah that has no commentary or anything, you don't normally see that because it's not a book that you can just pick up, start reading at page 1, and read all the way through to page 500 or whatever, and be perfectly fine. You're going to miss a lot along the way.
Which is...
and anyone who's tuned into my Mishnah class, either on Brachot, Pesachim, or Sanhedrin, will know that sometimes in our hour-long discussion, we'll go through 3 or 4 Mishnahs, 3 or 4 little paragraphs of text, in order to give enough explanation so that we know what's actually going on.
And that's what they're called when they're separated. They're called Mishnas, and it's the Mishnah and their Mishnas. Okay.
Right. Each little chunk, when you open up a standard printed copy of the Mishnah, it'll have a chapter, and then it'll have sub paragraphs, and each paragraph is called a Mishnah. So you'll say chapter 5, Mishnah 2.
And I guess the unraveling of that set of information is where we jump onto with the Gemara.
We'll talk about that more when we get to the Gemara. It's partly an unraveling and an extrapolation, but the Gemara has another more subtle goal in mind, which is teaching you how to think in general. Okay. It's not just a content book. The Mishnah is mostly about content. The Gemara is less about content and more about style, about how you do what you do. So it's a very different species, to be honest.
So can you sum up the Mishnah in a nutshell? What's the core purpose of the Mishnah?
So the core purpose of the Mishnah is to provide a reliable and universally accepted foundational explanation for how you actually live a Jewish life according to the Torah. Right. So it's something that you need desperately if you want to live a life according to the Torah. That is to say, you need a set of explanations of how to implement this wonderfully complicated document called Torah. But it would be too easy, especially in the modern and diverse world, for everyone to come up with their own version of that. And it would be too easy over time for each version of that, even if they started out similar, to end up wildly different within a generation or two. And the Mishnah provides that anchor. One of the metaphors that I often use when trying to teach this is the Torah is the ultimate anchor for our ship. It is the ultimate mooring point at the bottom of the ocean that gives us that rock solid place of where we are. The Mishnah and then the Talmud as well form the links from that anchor to the actual boat of life. And that is what allows us to move where we need to move, which will be within a range of places, but never so far that you have disconnected from the anchor, and never so narrow that when the water goes up or down, your boat gets sunk. So it's just the right amount of understanding to give a little bit of room without letting you float free, and to understand that room is still connected down to that anchor, and it's not its own invention.
That's very good. Right, thank you very much. Right, you guys at home, if you have any questions, leave them under this video. After we do the next episode, we're going to come back with a comment and answer series. So if you've been confused about any of the stuff that's come up in the last show, this show, or the next one, let us know. If you haven't, you're lying, because I've been confused. But that's okay. And
Confusion is the beginning of understanding.
absolutely. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You will find links under this video as well to Rabbi Neely's channel, where you'll find weekly Torah and Mishnah and other programs, which are really, really great shows. Thank you, Rabbi Neely, for giving us your time again this week.
Thank you, Jason.
And we'll see you guys next week.